This is one of those cases that doesn't sit right with me. This is Dorothy Jane Scott. She was murdered in the 1980s, and for years, the killer tormented her family with phantom phone calls. And to this day, they are still out there somewhere. So let's dive into the story. So the story of Dorothy's disappearance is really strange. On the night of May 28, 1980, Dorothy drove two of her friends to the hospital, as one of them had been bitten by a spider that night. So at the end of the hospital visit, while they were waiting to get a prescription filled, Dorothy Jane walked to go grab her car and bring it up so that the two friends could meet her outside. And once they were outside, the friends saw Dorothy's car coming towards them, but it quickly sped off and left them there. Now, they couldn't see who exactly was in the car, who was driving, because the headlights blinded them, but in a few hours, they reported her missing because they couldn't get in contact with Dorothy. And she would be missing for years. So in the months leading up to her murder, Dorothy had acquired a stalker. She had been receiving phone calls at work from a strange, unidentified male caller. And on these phone calls, this guy would tell her how much he loved her, and then he would state that he intended on killing her soon. One day, this phantom man even told Dorothy to go outside because he left a surprise on her car, and when she went outside to look, there was a single dead rose on her windshield, which is very creepy. On one of these particularly gruesome phone calls, the caller even stated that he planned on abducting Dorothy and chopping her up into little bits so that no one would ever find her. So these phone calls obviously terrified Dorothy, and in the week leading up to her disappearance, she started taking karate lessons. Okay, so let's flash back to the night that Dorothy disappeared. Remember, her friends were waiting for her outside of the hospital when they saw her car speed by them, but they couldn't see who was inside the vehicle. At around 4:30 a.m. that morning, 5 hours or so after they saw her car speeding away, the car was found abandoned in an alleyway 10 miles from the hospital, and it was on fire, which torched all evidence that could have been in the vehicle. So Dorothy would be missing for years, 4 years in fact. But it only took 1 week after her disappearance for the killer to start calling her own parents. So about every Wednesday afternoon for a period after Dorothy went missing, this caller would call her parents and say the strangest things. He would tell them things like, "I have her." He would also claim that he was the one who killed Dorothy. He was basically tormenting her parents and saying that he knows exactly where she is and what had happened, but he was never going to tell them. Now, 4 years later, this was going on for 4 years, in April of 1984, this caller once again called Dorothy's family, but instead of her mom picking up the phone that night, her dad did. And after her dad picked up the phone calls completely stopped. That is, until a few months later. Now, in August of 1984, a construction worker would come across a set of bones that belonged to a human and a dog. And those bones were eventually revealed to be those of Dorothy's. And immediately after her remains were found, the caller once again began to call her parents. This time, the police installed a recorder that bugged the family's phones. They were trying to get this guy's voice on recording and trace the phone calls, but the calls were never long enough for them to trace, and they still had no idea who this guy was. To this day, authorities still don't know how Dorothy died. And even though the phone calls eventually stopped, the killer's never been brought to justice. Now, the only suspect that's ever emerged in this case still doesn't have a name. It's the same guy that called, obviously, Dorothy's family, but it was a man who called a local newspaper just a few days after Dorothy went missing. And on this phone call, this guy said that he loved Dorothy, she had been cheating on him, and that he was the one who killed her. So that means that to this day, this killer is probably still out there somewhere, and they've never been brought to justice. This crime occurred over 40 years ago. There are no leads, and I don't think that this is a case that will ever be solved. If this killer dies, I'm sure that they're going to take this secret to the grave with them.